welcome back to EmberScreencast. Today we're going to continue talking about authentication. So last time we had our Monsters app and we had different pages that were authenticated that you couldn't get to if you weren't signed in. So if we log out and we try to get to those pages, it'll just tell us to log back in. So our data is safe, right? Well, not so fast, because here we can still access all that data if we know a little bit about our API. So a malicious hacker could probably guess something like this, especially if they've created web apps in the past. So today we're going to be protecting this information with token authentication. We can think of this problem as having several different parts. One is like a security guard that's asking for your identification. It wants to know that you have your ID badge. The second part is how our Ember app is displaying that ID badge. So we'll set up the security guard first in our Rails app, and we'll speed through that since it's going to be a little bit different for every type of backend you use. And so with a snap, I've got our Rails app asking for identification, and since we haven't yet set up our Ember app to give that authentication, it now blocks us out. That's what we want. Let me show you how that works. So first, we add an authentication token to our users. Then in our application controller, which can be accessed by all of our other controllers, we create a method called currentUser that'll get the XCSRF token from the front-end app. This is basically asking for your badge. And then it says, all right, if your badge matches a user, then you must be that user. So that's our currentUser method. And then we have the authorizeUser method, which is saying, hey, check for the badge. And if not, give them a 401 unauthorized. And then we call that. So for example, in users controller, we use the before action. So it's going to check for their badge before it ever gives them any user information. We can also set up some API endpoints to only give you information that's related to your current user. So here, when we're asking for multiple team memberships, it'll only give you the memberships that are on the current user, not all the memberships. So that's what having the badge gets you. That's how it protects you. But just checking for the badge isn't enough. You have to give the user a badge. And so we do that in the sessions controller. So what it does is you send it the email and the password. This is what happens when you're logging in. And then it tries to authenticate that user with the password. And if it authenticates, then it returns the JSON with the user ID and the authentication token, their badge. And if it doesn't authenticate, then it gives them back the 401, the you're not allowed here header. So the specific Rails application for this is you do this with bcrypt and has secure password. And then also, whenever you save a user for the first time, we have some stuff set up so it'll create the authentication token. And for the passwords, it has a password hash, so it never stores the plain password in the database. That's very important. Never save the plain password. All right, so that is the Rails details. And I'll go over this all as a system at the end after I go over the Ember stuff. And so that'll help you when you're trying to make it so you're setting up with a different backend that's not Rails. So now we're going to work on our Ember app. This is the login method we had before. It's obviously terrible. Let's get rid of a lot of that terrible stuff, leaving the stuff that we'll need to keep and put in somewhere in our new system. All right, so it's returning a promise. And now we're going to want to actually send something up to the server. We'll do that with an AJAX call. So we'll take our AJAX call, it's a post, and we'll send it to the URL sessions and send it the username and password. And then it'll get back the data. The data is the stuff that we sent back from the create session method on our Rails server. So we'll be getting the user ID and the authentication token. So we've got our token and user ID, and we'll want to use those. First, we'll set the user ID cookie, and we'll have to change this to an underscore. So it's setting the user ID so Ember knows what is happening, who's signed in. And then we'll also need to set another cookie, the authentication token cookie. And that will, of course, be authentication token. And we'll be using that to send up to the server. And then we'll want to sign in the user, but we don't have the user yet. We'll need to grab that from the server. Luckily, we've already built in the initialize from cookie method, which is usually done on init, but we can call it here. So that will take the user ID and it'll just find that user from the store. All right, and finally, we will resolve. And of course, we need to figure out how to reject it if it's rejected, so we'll put that in here, in the fail block. Then we'll need to do some cleanup on logout. So we remove the user ID, but we'll also want to remove the authentication token. So now that Ember has our badge, our authentication token set in our cookies, let's go about using this, showing it on every request. How do we do that? Well, one way is to create an initializer. And what this initializer does is we'll use jQuery Ajax prefilter, and then we'll set the request header, the XCSRF token, to the token that's set in our cookies. And so what this will do is every time we're sending a request via Ajax, it'll set the request header, the XCSRF token header, as the token. So this message of showing the token using the Ajax prefilter will work on both Ember data calls and plain Ajax calls. If you're sure that you're only going to be using Ember data calls, then you can use the headers hash in your Ember data adapter. So let's try out our setup. So as we can see, it redirects us back to login, as it should, and we can't access other people's data. But if we log in, then it'll correctly show us everything. Let me walk you through every step of what just happened. So when the login method is called, it sends the username and the password to the sessions create method in Rails. And so in the sessions create method, it tries to authenticate it by email and password. And if that works, then it sends back the user ID and the authentication token. Now that authentication token and user ID are set in the cookies, and then the user is initialized from cookies. And so then whenever you send something, it'll get passed through the Ajax prefilter, and that'll attach the authentication token to the request header. Then in Rails, or your server, whenever you try to get something, it'll get that request header, and then it'll find the current user from that token, like this. And there are also places where it won't get by unless that current user exists and you have the right token. And we call that before most of our methods. Of course, if you have the correct CSRF token, then you'll get what you had before, and you'll get all the information you need. So that's how you do token authentication with Ember and your backend server. Next session, we'll be talking about how to create a user. So we have how to log in a user and how to authenticate that user and get what they need. But we need a way to create that user. We'll do that next time. I'll see you then.